Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the echoing stone vaults of a medieval church just as the candles are being lit. The walls smell of cold limestone and incense, and somewhere in the distance a bell tolls in slow, solemn rhythm. Wooden pews creak beneath rough spun tunics, and even the rats pause to listen. But don't be fooled. This isn't just a building for prayers and hymns. This is the nerve center of an entire civilization. Every whispered confession, every collected tithe, every miracle claimed or sin condemned, it all filters through this place. It's beautiful, it's terrifying, and it's everywhere. You probably won't survive this journey with your medieval soul intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in T. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You push open the heavy wooden doors of your local parish, and the sound makes everyone glance back, because churches in medieval Europe aren't just for praying, they're everything. Courthouse, town square, schoolroom, status symbol, and once in a while, the site of a good old-fashioned riot. Religion isn't separate from daily life. It is daily life. You don't choose to go to church. You just do, unless you want suspicious glances and maybe your crops to mysteriously fail. Above you, the vaulted ceiling curves like the ribs of some divine whale. Sunlight slices in through stained glass, throwing colored shadows on the stone floor, painting saints across the mud on your boots. You shuffle to your pew, glancing nervously at the carved wooden saints lining the nave. They're watching you. They always are. Your village, like every village, is built around this place. Literally. The church tower is the first thing a traveler sees over the fields. It's the anchor. And it's where you go not just for Sunday Mass, but for everything from marriage to death. Baptism, right here. Crop blessings, absolutely. Election of the new village reeve, yes, but only after a prayer and a stern warning about divine judgment. The parish priest isn't just the guy in robes with a Bible. He's your moral compass, your translator of Latin mumbo-jumbo, your confessor, and, if you're lucky, your advocate when the bishop rolls into town looking stern and suspicious. And when he's not busy saving your soul, he might be mediating a land dispute or, awkwardly, reprimanding you for flirting too boldly at the maypole dance. Yes, he saw that. You shift uncomfortably on the hard wooden pew, not because of the draft, but because you know everyone around you is judging how well you genuflect. Some do it with theatrical flourish, others with bored knees. You try to look suitably humble, avoiding eye contact with old Agnes, who swears she saw you sneaking cheese on a fast day last week. But as you kneel, you realize something odd. You're illiterate, but the walls are telling stories. The stained glass glows with scenes, saints beheaded, devils driven off cliffs, doves descending like flaming cannonballs. Even the sculptures seem mid-monologue. In a world without books, the church is the closest thing to Netflix. You come for salvation, but you stay for the storytelling. The drama is real, sometimes too real. There's always that one guy who faints during Good Friday. Beneath all the beauty, though, power pulses. The church isn't just saving souls, it's shaping kingdoms. The Pope can crown a king or crush one. Bishops control more land than some nobles. And your local abbey, it's raking in rents from half the county. Render unto Caesar, they say, but Caesar's been replaced by a cassocked man with a ledger and a crucifix. Historians still argue whether the church genuinely believed it was saving the world or just got really good at playing Monopoly with people's fears and faith. Probably both. And then there's the quiet intimidation, not fire and brimstone exactly, but more like passive-aggressive immortality. Miss a feast day? Your soul might spend a few extra centuries in purgatory. Forget to confess that gossip about your neighbor. Oops! Hope you like spiritual limbo. Here's a fringe fact you probably didn't hear in school. Some churches literally chained Bibles to the pulpit. Not because they were afraid someone would read them, but because they were afraid someone would steal them. A single hand-copied Bible could cost as much as a farm, and you couldn't exactly check one out with your parish card. Back outside, you notice the churchyard doubling as the town bulletin board. Marriage bans are posted next to plague warnings. Someone's drawn a crude fish on the wall. It's either an early Christian symbol or a badly spelled love note. Hard to tell. Your eyes drift up the bell tower, where a fat rope disappears into the gloom. That bell up there? It'll call you to Mass, to war, or to your own funeral. It rings at dawn to remind you to get up, and again at sunset to remind you to pray, and maybe stop loitering behind the tavern. It tolls louder for rich burials and quieter for paupers. And if it rings at the wrong hour, well, that's usually bad news. As you leave, you realize this place, this awkward, cold, incense-filled space, is not a footnote in history. It is history. Every sermon, relic, and rotting tapestry is part of a story of strength, hope, and just a little stage fright. Because when your guard is down and danger lurks around every corner, you want someone to promise you paradise, or at least some order. Tomorrow the bells will ring again. You wake to the sound of bells. Not just any bell, mind you. It's the bell, the one that rules your life. Deep, resonant, and absolutely unapologetic about clanging at sunrise. You groan, shuffle out of your straw mattress, and mutter a half-hearted prayer as your toes hit the cold dirt floor. Welcome to another day in medieval Europe, where the church doesn't just whisper from the pulpit, it rings from every hilltop. That bell you hear, it's not just to get you to Mass. It tells you when to work, when to eat, when to stop eating, when to fast, when to pray, and sometimes when to run. It's your boss, your spiritual alarm clock, and possibly your nemesis. You can ignore the weather, ignore your aching back, but ignore the bell? That's basically daring eternal damnation and the village gossip mill at once. Time, as you know it, doesn't come in handy digital numbers or even personal sundials. It comes in prime, terse, sext, and none. Not names of medieval boy bands, but the canonical hours. Try explaining to your goat that he must wait until Lauds to be milked. The rhythm of your day is orchestrated like a liturgical symphony. You hear the bell at matins before sunrise, if you're extra holy, and then again at dawn. Work begins after prime, takes a pause at terce for a short prayer, breaks again at sext, and so on. Even your thoughts are supposed to be bracketed by bells. Think of it as sacred multitasking, now with 80% more guilt. And don't even think about ignoring the Angelus bell. That's the one that calls for a full pause, no matter what you're doing. Are you sowing seeds? Drop that plow and whisper, Hail Marys, like your crops depend on it, because they might. Historians still debate whether this pattern of pausing to pray improved productivity or just made everyone exceptionally good at mumbling with their hands full. You head to the fields, but you're never far from the sound of another bell. Smaller, fancier ones ring in the monasteries nearby. Some are hand-held, used by wandering friars. Others hang around the necks of processional crosses like divine cowbells. And the big one, that's the church tower bell, which might have its own name, like Bertha, or the voice of God but louder. You pause, momentarily distracted by a strange fact. In some places, bells were baptized. Yes, actual water, godparents, Latin blessings, the whole shebang. People believed these bells could drive off storms, ward off demons, and maybe even protect crops. One bell in France was said to cry real tears during a famine. Another in Germany had its own custom-made cloak. You think your church pew is fancy. That bell has a wardrobe. Even beyond the practical use, the bell is symbolic. It reminds you that time belongs to God, not you, not your Lord, not your local market. Every hour that passes is a little nudge. Hey, remember your soul? It's the medieval version of a calendar notification, except instead of a soft chime, it could be loud enough to scare chickens off their roosts. There's something oddly soothing about it all, even with the occasional startle. You don't have to worry about scheduling. Someone else has done it for you, and their authority is divine. All you have to do is follow the sounds and hope the church doesn't change its mind. The priest, of course, is up before everyone. He's already chanted half the psalms of the day by the time you're wiping the sleep from your eyes. You once asked him how he always knows what hour it is. He looked at you like you'd asked whether angels have teeth. By the way, that's an actual theological debate. Then he gestured at the bell tower. God always rings on time, he said, then went back to mumbling in Latin. And don't forget about feast days. Those bells ring differently. There's more fanfare, more ceremony. It's not just about the time, it's about the mood. Somber tolling for funerals, triumphant peals for Easter, wild, joyful ringing for the feast of St. Vitus, during which everyone dances until their legs give out. It's hard not to, really. Those bells hit something primal. Still, beneath all that musical holiness, there's a power move happening. The church isn't just marking time, it's owning it. The very rhythm of your day is dictated from the bell tower. And if that bell doesn't ring, people panic. What happened? Did the priest die? Did the world end? Did Bertha fall? It's an elegant system of control disguised as piety. Some historians argue it helped unify society, a kind of spiritual time card that leveled peasant and noble alike. Others say it was a form of domination dressed up in ritual. But whether it brought peace or pressure, it worked. There's a little-known twist to all this. In some communities, certain bells were gendered. That's right. They were believed to have voices, and those voices were either male or female depending on pitch and usage. A high, clear bell might be associated with the Virgin Mary, while a deeper, ominous tone evoked the wrath of God or the impending approach of taxes. Yes, sometimes the two felt eerily similar. By midday, the bell calls you again, this time to rest and pray. You sit under a tree, bread in hand, and half-heartedly recite a psalm. You're not even sure what it means, but it feels right. The rhythm soothes you. Around you, others pause too. The field goes still. For a moment, the world feels aligned, like a cosmic heartbeat, syncing everyone together. And then the bell rings again, sharp and commanding. Time to move, time to work, time to obey. You sigh, tuck the bread crust into your pouch, and return to your task. But something in you appreciates the sound now. It's not just noise, it's history, tradition, faith, and maybe, just maybe, a little hypnosis. The bell is both comfort and cage. You live by it, you die by it, and one day it will toll just for you. You're sweating through your woolen tunic, dragging a sack of turnips to the village edge, when your neighbor hisses, "You did tithe this week, right?" You freeze. Your stomach drops. Did you? You think back. Was that this week or last? You've been busy with harvest, and honestly, the church already has more cheese than God. But that's not how this works. Tithing isn't some gentle, optional act of generosity. It's a 10% spiritual tax with teeth, and not paying it could get you labeled a sinner, a cheat, or worse, someone who doesn't fear eternal judgment. And trust me, nothing travels faster through a medieval village than a rumor about someone skimping on their tithe. You hustle back toward the church, sack swinging. Your coins clink anxiously. That bag of turnips is suddenly looking like a bargaining chip for your afterlife. Here's the thing. Tithes aren't always money. Sometimes it's grain, chickens, or a chunk of salted pork. You might even donate labor, helping repair a church wall or dig a drainage ditch. That's called boon work, and it might save your soul or your reputation, because refusing to tithe doesn't just offend the priest, it offends God. Or at least, that's what everyone says. And the church? Oh, it keeps track. There are tithe barns the size of manor houses, stuffed with offerings, thatched roof fortresses of wheat, cheese, and wool, all donated by people like you, hoping to stay on the Lord's good side. The Lord up above, yes, but also the Lord of the land, because, surprise, local nobility sometimes get a cut of church income too. Isn't that wholesome? Your priest, robed and serene, accepts your offering at the door. He gives a small nod. No lecture today, no public shaming. You exhale, only now realizing how tight your chest had been. For a second, you feared you'd be the next example in Sunday's homily. And believe me, the church loves examples. If you don't tithe, maybe your crops fail. Maybe your child gets sick. Maybe a cow drops dead with no warning. Coincidence? Maybe. But the priest might suggest you make a generous gift to the altar just in case. Historians still argue whether the church actually believed in this kind of spiritual extortion, or if it simply learned how to run a really efficient multi-branch corporation with a hell-based incentive plan. Want a quirky detail? Some parishes used to post tithe lists on the church door. Public, written, named. If you didn't contribute, your neighbors knew. They all knew. Suddenly, folks who used to greet you with a cheerful God bless just squint at your shoes and whisper, "Welcome to medieval social pressure, holy edition." Tithes didn't just support the clergy, they funded candles, chalices, processions, choir robes, bell ropes, and those elaborate embroidered altar cloths that somehow always smelled faintly of lavender and anxiety. They paid for festivals, repairs, pilgrim shelters, and sometimes bribes to keep the bishop from poking too closely into parish affairs. But where does all that money go, you wonder? Some of it stays local, sure, but a lot gets passed upward, like breadcrumbs leading to a very well-fed archbishop. Eventually, some of it trickles toward Rome, because, yes, the Pope wants his cut too. The medieval church doesn't just deal in prayers, it deals in percentages. And if you think you can get away with skipping your tithe by hiding income or lying about how many sheep you really own, well, enter the church accountant. Not a man of God necessarily, but a man of math. He shows up with a ledger, a grim smile, and the cold efficiency of a medieval tax auditor. He may not carry a sword, but his ink-stained fingers hold terrifying power. Now, picture this. It's the annual tithe collection day. A long line forms outside the church. People wait with baskets, sacks, or reluctant geese. Children fidget. Old women mutter. There's always that one guy who tries to argue about the real value of his carrots. The priest doesn't even blink, just gestures at the church warden, who writes something down ominously in a book. And here's the fringe fact of the day. In some places, people could pay their tithe in beer. That's right. If you brewed your own ale, and who didn't? Part of your spiritual duty might involve handing over a few pints to the priest. He'd accept it with a solemn nod and, if you were lucky, maybe a wink. The Holy Spirit works in mysterious ways and occasionally smells like hops, but not everyone accepts the system quietly. Whispered complaints echo in the taverns. Why does the church need new candlesticks when I can't afford salt? Didn't Father Gerard just buy a new mule? And if someone gets too loud with their protests, suddenly they're labeled troublesome, or worse, heretical. That's a fast track to questioning, confession, and a long conversation with someone holding a very hot pair of tongs. Still, rebellion simmers. In later centuries, entire movements will rise around resentment of tithe collection. Some towns will riot, others will refuse. But in your quiet village, you grumble, pay, and hope no one notices the bruise on your apple offering. As you finally leave the church steps, lighter in both spirit and coin, you glance back. The priest is already inside, counting donations. The bell rings again, not harshly, but like a sigh. You're safe for another week, probably. For now at least, you've bought a little peace, and maybe, just maybe, staved off a few centuries in purgatory. You tug your hood low and shuffle into the back row, trying to stay invisible, but of course the priest spots you instantly. He gives a little nod that somehow says, I know exactly how much Latin you don't understand. It's time for the weekly sermon, and even though you'd rather be checking on your leaky roof, you're here. Not just because of faith, not just because of that terrifying dream you had about a demon goat last week. No, you're here because this man, this slightly balding figure in robes, is the smartest person within 100 miles, and that means he's dangerous. You might think of a medieval priest as just a preacher, someone who blesses your butter and mumbles Latin over your funeral. But the truth? He's your one-man local authority. In a world where most people can't read, he holds the keys to everything written. Legal contracts, land deeds, birth records, the only love poems not carved on outhouse walls. He reads, writes, speaks Latin, and remembers your last confession with alarming detail. And unless you live in a rare town with a separate schoolmaster, he's also your teacher, or your kid's teacher if they're lucky enough to attend parish school, which means he's the one telling your son that the earth is a divine sphere, and also the reason your daughter is now correcting your pronunciation of amen again. Classrooms back then aren't full of chalkboards and rows of neat little desks. Think drafty room in the church vestry, maybe with 2 benches and a straw floor, smelling faintly of ink and feet. Still, if your child is lucky enough to attend, they'll be drilled in Latin phrases, copied religious texts by candlelight, and taught the heavenly hierarchy so thoroughly they'll rank angels like trading cards. There's something surreal about hearing your pigpen-scented child recite the names of all 7 deadly sins in Latin while still managing to forget to wash their hands. And confession, that's a whole different layer of local authority. You walk into the booth, knees cracking, heart thumping. You whisper your sins, petty theft, lustful thoughts, swearing when the donkey sat down mid-cart ride. He listens, doesn't judge, not allowed anyway. Then gives you penance, a few Hail Marys, maybe fasting, or the deeply inconvenient order to apologize to your neighbor, whom you absolutely still blame for the goose incident. Historians still argue whether confession was a form of emotional release or a very clever psychological control system. One theory, it worked like a medieval lie detector. If someone didn't confess regularly, their neighbors assumed they were up to something. And sometimes your priest isn't even local. He might have arrived from another parish entirely, reassigned due to unrest, or a misunderstanding about a nun and some rhubarb wine. You don't ask. You just nod politely and try not to be the next story. Then there's the priest's power in daily disputes. Who owns that plot of land with the weird rock? Ask the priest. Who determines whether your cousin's sudden illness was divine punishment or just bad water? Again, the priest. He's not a doctor, but he knows enough to recommend some leeches and a lot of prayer. And he will mention in Sunday's sermon that those who neglect their hygiene are unpleasing to God. You've heard that one before. The oddest part? He might be just as trapped as you. The church has hierarchy, and your priest answers to a bishop, who answers to an archbishop, who answers to Rome. And sometimes Rome sends letters asking for money, which he now has to extract gently, preferably without triggering a pitchfork situation. Want something from him? A letter written to a nearby monastery? Permission to marry someone from another village? Help translating that mysterious Latin phrase scratched on your door? He might help, but he also might ask for a small favor in return, or a chicken, or a promise to finally stop skipping Lent. Here's a strange fact. Some rural priests had side hustles, brewing beer, raising bees, even copying manuscripts for nearby nobles. One English priest reportedly ran a highly successful goose rental business. Yes, that's right, rentable geese for seasonal lawn maintenance and, weirdly, intimidation. But not all priests were salt-of-the-earth types. Some got rich, really rich, especially if their parish had relics or pilgrimage traffic, gold-threaded vestments, imported wines, soft beds, even private servants. The bishop might scowl about worldly temptation, but as long as the priest kept the tithe flowing, little was said. And in more corrupt corners, you might hear whispers of priests who sold indulgences, pocketed offerings, or conveniently misread scriptures to favor their wealthy patrons. That's a future scandal, though. Luther and his hammer are still a few centuries away. You remember hearing as a child that priests were like bridges between God and people. holy men, untouchable. But now, as you watch him adjust his robe and squint at the script for Sunday's Mass, he just looks tired, maybe even human. He coughs, scratches his chin, mutters something about the font freezing over, and trudges back into the sacristy. You're reminded that this same man once helped bury your mother and baptize your niece. And you remember how gently he laid her down, and how steadily his voice rose during the prayer. There's power in that, yes, but also grace. As you walk home, the late bells ring out over the fields. You pass children practicing Latin hymns, a woman asking the priest to bless her butter churn, and two boys arguing about which saint has the coolest death story. You smile. The church might be powerful, but today, at least, it's also just part of the village, a strange mix of fear and comfort, of Latin and laughter, of ritual and the occasional rented goose. And tomorrow, when you return with your next question about angels or taxes or that strange mole on your arm, the priest will be there, quill in hand, judgment in heart, and probably one eye on your soul and the other on your turnips. You're ankle deep in mud, trying to herd a donkey that clearly hates you. When you hear the word archdeacon, you stop. The donkey takes the opportunity to bolt sideways. You don't care, because if there's one phrase that turns peasant blood cold faster than crop failure or you've been summoned, it's anything involving church officials from out of town. The priest? You know him. He baptized your nephew. He hiccups when he's nervous. He once forgot the Latin word for bread. But the archdeacon, that's different. He's from somewhere else, somewhere important. And when he arrives in your parish, he brings paperwork, judgments, and a gaze that can spot heresy from 50 yards away. You dust off your tunic and hurry toward the church, where a small crowd is already forming. Word spreads fast when God's bureaucrats come to town. The medieval church, you quickly learn, is a machine of hierarchy, tightly structured, endlessly layered, and terrifyingly efficient. At the bottom are village priests like yours, scrambling to keep candles lit and parishioners from accidentally starting theological revolutions. Above them are rural deans who supervise small clusters of parishes, then archdeacons who oversee whole regions and report to bishops, who report to archbishops, who report to the Pope, who, as far as you're concerned, might as well be God's office manager. So, when the archdeacon rides in, tall and severe on a horse that probably has its own ecclesiastical title, everyone straightens their backs and pretends they've definitely been fasting properly. His job is to inspect the church building, the accounts, the behavior of the clergy, and, awkwardly, the behavior of you. Did you get married without proper banns? Has someone been skipping confession? Is the choir boy living in the priest's barn? These are not harmless questions. The archdeacon brings a clerk, a notebook the size of a wagon wheel, and an expression that hasn't smiled since the last millennium. He's the IRS, the HR department, and a moral watchdog all rolled into one. And that's before he pulls out the excommunication forms. You didn't know this, but there's a whole genre of medieval punishment that's spiritual and social. Maybe someone in your village got into a loud, drunken brawl at a feast. The priest scolded him, sure, but the archdeacon, he might sentence that person to wear sackcloth in church for a month, or to stand barefoot in the cold, holding a candle the size of a sword, while everyone avoids eye contact. Humiliation as penance. It's like a medieval apology YouTube video, but with more frostbite. Here's a strange historical tidbit. There were even sin registers, actual ledgers where clergy recorded the transgressions of their flock. Gossiping, missing Mass, working on holy days, not paying tithes, or, get this, dancing too provocatively. So, if you think you've escaped judgment because your priest is chill, think again. Someone somewhere is writing it down. And while the bishop gets all the fancy hats and cathedral processions, the archdeacon's power is more insidious. He walks into villages like a wind that chills everyone's nerves. He speaks with authority, but never raises his voice. He might hand your priest a long list of areas of concern, which includes, say, an altar cloth that smells suspiciously of boiled cabbage. Historians still argue whether these inspections were meant to genuinely improve moral standards or simply enforce control through paperwork and fear. Honestly, it could be both. Nothing says divine order like being told your incense is out of regulation. And let's talk about scribes. The archdeacon never travels without one. These quill-wielding, ink-stained humans are walking hard drives. They record complaints, transgressions, miracles, and sometimes weirdly detailed descriptions of suspicious moles. Your entire village could be summarized in a paragraph, somewhere in a leather-bound book filed in a distant archive no one will ever read again unless someone gets famous or excommunicated or both. You sneak into the back of the church. The inspection is underway. The archdeacon pokes the altar with a small silver rod. He sniffs the holy water. He flips open the missal and checks that the Latin is properly inscribed. You don't know Latin, but it sure looks Latin. He frowns. Uh-oh. Your priest stands nearby, sweating discreetly. He tries to make small talk, mentions the new stone step added last month. The archdeacon grunts. The clerk writes something down. You wonder briefly if this is what Judgment Day feels like. And then comes the questioning. Not just the priest, everyone. Parishioners are pulled aside, asked if the priest conducts Mass properly, if there have been any strange visions, outbursts, or unexplained goat births. Don't laugh, it's on the list. You thank your stars you didn't mention that dream you had about St. Anthony and the turnip. But here's the odd thing. Some people like the visit. For them, it's a chance to speak up. That candle tax Father Bernard started collecting, probably not legit. That rumor about someone hoarding relic donations, the archdeacon might listen. And if he takes your side, well, now you've got divine backup. Still, Everyone walks on eggshells. One misplaced word, and suddenly you're being accused of improper reverence or heresy adjacent behavior, and that's not something that goes away quickly. Want a weird fringe note? In a few rare cases, the archdeacon would even inspect the graveyard, not to pay respects, but to ensure burials were properly performed. Yes, even in death, the church had rules. Wrong burial site, wrong ritual. Your soul might be in the wrong postal zone for eternity. Eventually, after hours of scrutiny, muttered prayers, and quill scratches, the archdeacon leaves. No blessings, no smiles, just a faint nod and a trail of bureaucratic anxiety. You watch him ride off, half expecting thunder to roll dramatically in the distance. It doesn't, just a crow cawing sarcastically. The village exhales. Your priest slumps. He'll spend the next week trying to fix every nitpicky complaint before it reaches the bishop. But for now, peace returns. Sort of. Because even after the archdeacon's gone, his words linger. People talk. Was the altar cloth really that dusty? Did someone actually confess to eating meat on a Friday? And somewhere, miles away, a scribe is filing your village's sins into a big dusty book, just in case God needs the receipts. You're lying awake on a straw mattress, listening to mice argue under the floorboards, when you start thinking about the church again, specifically about how rich it is, not just in souls, but in stuff, land, silver, paintings, embroidered cloths, imported incense, and at least 3 crucifixes that glitter a little too much to be humble. You glance toward the dark window and imagine the tall silhouette of the church looming over your village, smug as a gilded rooster on its steeple. Because let's be honest, when it comes to medieval wealth, the church doesn't just have money. It practically invented the flex. You head to morning mass, and there it is again. Gold candlesticks taller than your niece, chalices so shiny they make your chipped pottery weep, and altar frontals stitched with threads that probably cost more than your whole cottage. You're praying in a space that feels halfway between a holy sanctuary and a treasure chest. But how did it get this way? One word: land, and lots of it. The medieval church is Europe's biggest landowner. By some estimates, it controls up to a third of all usable land in certain regions. Imagine that. Every third field you see, every orchard, meadow, or vineyard you pass, it might belong to the church, and by extension, to God, but also, realistically, to an abbot with excellent taste in cloaks. That land generates income. Farmers rent it, monasteries harvest it, and lords donate it in exchange for spiritual brownie points. Sometimes entire villages are owned by a single monastery. Your tax doesn't go to a local noble. It goes to a monk who's never touched a plow in his life, but who knows exactly how many chickens you owe this quarter. And donations? Oh, they pour in. Rich nobles leave manors and vineyards in their wills. Pilgrims drop coins into every candle box they pass. gilds fun chapels and stained glass windows to show off both their devotion and their wealth. It's the original prosperity gospel, only instead of yachts and private jets, it's relic shrines and marble altars. Historians still argue whether these displays of wealth were meant to inspire awe or just intimidate. Maybe both. There's certainly something spiritually motivating about praying beneath a ceiling painted with cherubs and scenes of heaven, or terrifying, depending on how the artist depicted hell. And don't get too excited about that poor little country church down the road with its creaky bell and chipped font. Even modest parishes are required to maintain a certain level of ornamentation, because beauty, the church argues, brings glory to God. It also brings prestige to the bishop, so win-win. One of the strangest and most surprisingly expensive elements of church wealth? Vestments. That's right, liturgical fashion. Those robes your priest wears aren't just comfy pajamas. Some are encrusted with pearls, woven with golden thread, and lined with imported silk. There are entire inventories from medieval cathedrals listing dozens of different outfits for different seasons, feasts, and ceremonies. Green for ordinary time, purple for penance, white for high holy days, glittery for maximum intimidation. There's even a documented instance of a bishop owning a mitre, that's the pointy hat, decorated with actual unicorn horn. Spoiler, it was probably narwhal tusk. But you can imagine the bidding war if it ever showed up on medieval eBay. And then there's the architecture. Some churches are simple, yes. A square nave, a stone altar, maybe a sad little cross leaning sideways. But cathedrals are absurd. Towering spires, flying buttresses, elaborate rose windows, statues leering from every corner. These buildings take decades, sometimes centuries to build. Entire generations of stonemasons die before the final roof tile is laid. And yet the people keep building, keep donating, keep hauling those stones up impossible scaffolding. Why? Because to them it's worth it. This isn't just about showing off, it's about creating heaven on earth, or at least a convincing replica. Of course, not everyone is thrilled about this divine accumulation of wealth. You've probably heard murmurs in the tavern. A local farmer squints at the new golden monstrance and mutters, "That could have fed 30 families." A young scholar questions whether Christ would really want a silver censer engraved with Latin poetry. Someone else mentions a priest in the next town who owns 2 horses, both shod in silver. One of them is named Grace. Still, it's dangerous to voice these thoughts too loudly. People who challenge the church's wealth sometimes find themselves on the wrong end of a theological lecture, or worse, a heresy trial. So the complaints stay low and vague, like the muttering wind that sneaks through the chapel rafters. Want a quirky detail? In some churches, wealthy families could rent space near the altar for their personal tombs. That's right, eternal real estate. The closer you were buried to the altar, the closer you were believed to be to salvation. So if you were rich enough, you could quite literally buy a better shot at heaven. Hope you didn't spend all your money on sheep. But here's the thing. Even amid all the glitter and grandeur, there's a weird beauty to it, the soft glow of candlelight reflecting off gold, the organ's echo swirling through a vaulted ceiling, the way a jeweled cross catches the sunrise through stained glass. It's not subtle, but it is effective. It makes you feel small, reverent, and, dare you admit it, a little enchanted. The church knows this. It relies on it. Every gold chalice, every carved saint's niche, every echo of chant in a marble nave, it's all designed to pull you out of your muddy, itchy, livestock-filled life and make you think, maybe there really is something higher. You head home that night, squinting up at the church tower's outline against the stars. You're poor. The church is rich. But for now, you both sleep beneath the same sky, and tomorrow you'll be back, kneeling before the gold, whispering prayers in the candlelit hush, hoping that in exchange for your tithe, your turnips grow straight, and your cow stops foaming at the mouth. The door creaks open with a groan that sounds suspiciously like someone being denied absolution. You step inside, eyes adjusting to the dim. The nave smells of old wax, incense, and something else you can't quite place, wet stone and secrets. The priest is nowhere to be seen. Instead, a figure in a brown habit moves slowly between pews, whispering to himself and gently sweeping dust with a broom made of twigs. Ah, a monk, not the chanting in the mountains, vow of silence kind, though those do exist, but the kind who lives right here in the nearby priory. He's part of a small brotherhood attached to your parish. You watch him work, methodical, prayerful, and slightly hunched, like the weight of every psalm ever written sits on his shoulders. You've heard the stories. Monks rise before dawn, pray 7 times a day, and rarely speak unless it's scripture. Their lives are a mix of discipline, duty, and damp wool. They sleep in communal dormitories, eat plain food, and spend their days copying manuscripts, brewing ale, or, if they're Benedictines, growing cabbages with suspicious intensity. The medieval monastery isn't a vacation retreat or a place you go when you find yourself. It's a machine, a spiritual engine fueled by silence, order, and a stunning amount of rules. The Rule of St. Benedict? Think of it as the ultimate medieval user manual, 73 chapters covering everything from when to pray to how to fold your robe. Historians still argue whether monasticism was meant as pure devotion or a form of escape for second sons and failed nobles. Probably both. Join a monastery and you're suddenly cloaked in authority. You answer to your abbot, not your father, and you're technically married to God, which admittedly makes family reunions awkward. You quietly approach, nodding to the monk. He offers a faint smile and goes back to sweeping. His robe swishes softly, brown, patched, and lined with prayers. You notice his belt has a wooden cross hanging from it, and a loop where his rosary dangles like a medieval keychain. Behind the church, the priory looms. It's not huge, but it's imposing in that gray, squared off, we have our own beehives kind of way. A courtyard garden hums with bees. Inside, low stone corridors connect the dormitory, the scriptorium, the refectory, and, of course, the chapel. Every step echoes like a whispered confession. You peer into the scriptorium, half curious. There, in the gloom, another monk sits hunched over parchment, his face inches from a page covered in elaborate looping script. He's illuminating a manuscript, a book of hours, maybe, with colors made from crushed minerals and gold leaf so thin it flutters if he breathes wrong. He hasn't blinked in what feels like an hour. You're afraid if you cough, he'll jump and accidentally paint a halo where there should be a nose. Copying texts isn't just a task. It's an act of devotion. Each word is a prayer, each decorated capital a burst of worship. And the monks know their books will outlive them. That's the point. Immortality through ink. Still, you can't help but wonder how many of them secretly add doodles in the margins. Snarky pigs, jousting rabbits, bored saints with sassy expressions. Fringe fact, they totally did. Some surviving manuscripts include strange little drawings of monkeys playing bagpipes and nuns sword-fighting snails. Historians are still trying to figure out why. Back in the courtyard, the bell rings. Not the big dramatic church bell. This one's smaller, faster. Time for sext, the midday prayer. The monks file into the chapel in silence, their procession smooth and solemn. You linger near the door and peek in. Chant fills the air, low, droning, otherworldly. It wraps around you like a fog. You don't understand the Latin, but something in your chest goes quiet anyway. Monks are the unsung engines of medieval life. They tend the sick. They store knowledge. They run schools. They brew surprisingly good beer. They keep bees, mend clothes, make parchment, and collect herbs. If the church is a ship, monks are down in the hull, rowing quietly, forever. But not all monasteries are humble little prayer huts in the woods. Some are vast estates with hundreds of monks, sprawling vineyards, libraries taller than your cottage, and enough relics to make a bishop weep. Wealthy monasteries often double as political players. Abbots sit in councils, advise kings, and occasionally raise armies. Yes, armies, if the land dispute gets really heated. And the monks? Sometimes they're caught between heaven and prophet. Historians still debate whether monasteries lost their spiritual focus as they gained power. Were they holy men or landlords in robes? Depends on the abbey, and probably on how good the wine was that year. You leave the priory as the chanting fades. The sun slants over the cloister roof. Bees hum lazily above the garden. For a moment, the whole world feels quiet, structured, predictable. The monks will pray again in 3 hours, then again before bed, and once in the middle of the night. You, meanwhile, still have a cart to fix, and a goat that's refusing to come down from the roof. Still, you feel lighter somehow, calmer, like some of that sacred rhythm rubbed off on you, and maybe, just maybe, when night falls and the monks return to their dormitory, breathing in sync, souls attuned to ancient chants, they'll dream of peaceful things, or sword-fighting snails. You wake in the middle of the night, shivering, because someone forgot to stuff the fire with peat. Outside, the wind claws at the shutters, and for a moment everything feels unsettlingly still. Then, softly, in the distance, you hear it, a faint melody, like someone chanting a lullaby to the moon. You know what that is. The monks are up. Again. It's time for matins, the nighttime prayer, somewhere between midnight and dawn. Most people are asleep, dreaming of warmer beds or accidentally marrying their cousins. But the monks? They're in the chapel, eyes red with sleep, voices rising in a harmony more haunting than holy. Why? Because this is how the medieval church keeps the lights on. Spiritually speaking, prayer isn't just something you do when you want something. It's a job, a duty, a cycle. A monk's life revolves around the divine office, also called the Liturgy of the Hours, 8 prescribed times of daily prayer. They're named Matins, Lauds, Prime, Terce, Sext, Nun, Vespers, and Compline. If those sound like spells from a Latin wizard school, well, yes. And here's the kicker. The prayers don't stop. Even if someone dies, even if the roof caves in, even if the bishop shows up unannounced and starts asking why the wine cellar inventory lists miscellaneous barrels, someone is always praying. It's like divine shift work. You turn over in your straw bed grumbling, but secretly you admire it. That kind of devotion, night after night, voice after voice, even when your body aches and your candle's burned out. That's something. You don't have to understand every word of the chant to feel it settle deep in your bones. And the structure, it's everywhere. The church has rules for everything, not just prayers and fasting, but your calendar, your marriage, even your bath schedule. Yes, really. Want to get married? Better announce it 3 Sundays in a row. That's called banns. It gives time for anyone to shout, "Actually, I'm married to her already," or "He promised me 3 goats and ran off." No surprises allowed at the altar. The church controls who you can marry. No cousins closer than the 7th degree, unless you're royal, in which case, do what you want, apparently. How you marry, in a church, with a priest, and when. Spoiler, you can't get married during Lent. Nothing says romance buzzkill like being told your wedding is too joyful for Jesus right now. Historians still debate how much power the church really had over peasant marriages. Were people sneaking off to pledge themselves in secret, or did they really follow all the rules? Probably both. But one thing's clear. If you didn't have a church-blessed union, you were in trouble. Your children might be considered illegitimate, and your property claims suddenly got very shaky. Also, Aunt Agnes would never stop whispering about it, and if your marriage turned sour, tough luck. Divorce isn't a thing. Annulments are possible, but only for very specific, very church-approved reasons, like if your spouse turns out to be your cousin, or you were drunk during the vows, or you both forgot marriage was for procreation and not just singing duets, which, yes, was apparently an actual case. So people stay married. Even when they can't stand each other, they pray for patience, or vengeance, or, at the very least, silence. You think of old Osric and his wife, Marjorie. They haven't spoken in 3 months, but they still show up to Mass, kneel side by side, and glare at the priest like this is all his fault. Maybe it is, maybe not, but the Church certainly has thoughts on how they should behave, and none of those thoughts involve throwing turnips. Want a weird side note? There were church courts specifically to deal with marriage disputes, moral offenses, and other spiritual crimes. These were called ecclesiastical courts, and they could fine you, sentence you to public penance, or, in really juicy cases, summon you to explain why you were caught in the barn with someone else's spouse during Vespers. They had no jails, no stocks, just shame and paperwork, which honestly might be worse. You roll out of bed, stretch, and think about all the rules that quietly shape your life. Some make sense. Don't steal. Don't blaspheme. Don't let your goat wander into the church again. But others, more subtle. You fast on Fridays. You don't eat eggs during Lent. You confess if you break a religious vow, even if that vow was just not eating 3 times before Compline. It's exhausting, but also comforting. The Church gives you a framework, a scaffolding. It tells you what's good, what's bad, and what color vestment means today is a feast or a funeral. And while it can be overbearing, even frightening, it also gives meaning to the boring stuff. Bread isn't just bread, it's blessed. A bell isn't just a bell, it marks sacred time. Your muddy little village isn't just surviving, it's part of a cosmic dance between heaven and earth, choreographed down to the hour. You pass the chapel and hear chanting again, lauds this time, just before dawn. The monks' voices echo softly through the fog, like whispers from another world. You stop, just for a second, and listen. The sky is pale with morning. A rooster coughs somewhere, and for all its rules, its judgment, its obsession with sin and sacrifice, the Church has made something beautiful here. Even if you're still not sure about that part where you can't marry your sixth cousin because of consanguinity. Your boots squelch in the muck as you follow the procession out of the village. It's not a holy day, not a feast, not even a particularly interesting Tuesday, but the whole town is on the move. Men with grim faces, women clutching rosaries, children wide-eyed and whispering. At the front, 4 men carry a bier covered in a pale cloth. Beneath it lies poor old Wulfric, newly deceased, and hopefully not haunting the butter churn this time. You guessed it, today's a funeral. The medieval church doesn't just govern your waking life, it oversees your death too. From your first breath to your final breath, and even well beyond, the church has a plan, a right, and, let's be honest, a fee for that. Death is serious business. You may live in a drafty shack, eat stew that's mostly turnip, and bathe once a season, but when you die, that's when the real ceremony kicks in. The bells toll, slow and heavy. People pause in their chores, cross themselves, and murmur a quick prayer. May his soul find peace, someone says. Hope they remembered to pay for the candles, someone else mutters. Because, yes, even death comes with a price tag. The priest meets the procession at the churchyard gate, swinging a censer that belches fragrant clouds. Incense, divine Febreze for your soul. Wulfric's body, wrapped neatly in linen, is sprinkled with holy water. Psalms are chanted. The air is cold, but your palms sweat. Because even now, in this sacred moment, everyone's wondering the same thing. Is he going to heaven? Or is he lingering? The church teaches that most souls go to purgatory. It's not hell, though if you're stuck there long enough, it might as well be. It's like spiritual quarantine, where souls are scrubbed clean of lingering sins before being allowed into paradise. Think of it as divine laundry, and the more prayers said on your behalf, the faster you dry. Which brings us to masses for the dead. After burial, the family, if they have the coin, pays for special prayers. The more masses, the better. It's a medieval subscription model for salvation. Can't afford much? Maybe 1 or 2. Are you a rich merchant with a guilty conscience? Order 50. A noble with a record of dubious land deals and a mistress named Alfreda? Better make it 100 and throw in a stained glass window donation just to be safe. Historians still argue whether these payments were sincere gestures of faith or just a high-stakes spiritual arms race. Probably both. Either way, priests kept excellent ledgers. You might not know your own birthday, but you will know how many masses your uncle paid for. And if you're particularly devoted or particularly paranoid, you could set aside money in your will for chantries. These were small chapels, sometimes within larger churches, where priests were paid specifically to say masses for one soul over and over and over, forever, ideally, though realistically only as long as the money held out. Want a strange detail? Some people included food in their will for their soul's journey, as if purgatory could be bribed with boiled eggs and pottage. Others left instructions for distributing alms to the poor, because helping the needy, even after death, was a ticket to spiritual brownie points. And it doesn't stop at the funeral. Anniversary masses become a thing. Each year the family is supposed to remember the departed with more prayers, more candles, maybe a special meal. It's part grief, part tradition, part let's make sure Grandma isn't haunting the outhouse. Meanwhile, Saint's intercession becomes spiritual insurance. If you were named after Saint Cuthbert, maybe he'll put in a good word for you in the afterlife, especially if you donated a lamb or two to his shrine, which conveniently the local monastery runs. No conflict of interest there. You glance around the churchyard. The graves are simple, some marked with wooden crosses, others with stones carved crudely by someone who once carved pigs for a living. A few are completely unmarked, overgrown with weeds, but the church sees them all. Each one is a soul in progress, and just beneath the soil there's a layer of theology so dense you could bury your cart in it. Want a quirky bit? In some parts of Europe, if the deceased was thought to have died in sin, or if there were whispers of sorcery, they'd be buried at a crossroads instead of in the consecrated churchyard, sometimes even face down. That way, if they rose from the grave, they'd dig away from the village. Safety first. Back inside, the priest offers the final blessing. He raises his hand, murmurs Latin, and the villagers respond with a ragged amen. It's done. Wulfric is in God's hands now, or possibly in line behind 3 bakers, 2 millers, and a nun with attitude, all waiting to see who gets through purgatory first. You step out into the gray morning. Someone's already talking about the after-feast, bread, beer, and a slow retelling of Wulfric's best stories, including the time he accidentally baptized a goose. You smile. Death is sad, yes, but also familiar, comforting even. The rituals hold you up when grief threatens to pull you under, and through it all, the church hums along. Prayers said, bells rung, souls counted like seeds in a granary, because in the medieval world, death isn't the end. It's just another step in a very, very long procession. And you're all walking it, slowly, solemnly, one mass at a time. You're minding your own business, trying to sell a moderately bruised turnip at market, when someone rushes in yelling, "Relics! They've brought relics!" The crowd stirs like someone just announced free beer. Within minutes the square empties, leaving only your turnip and a confused chicken. You follow, of course. Who wouldn't? Relics, bits of bone, fabric, teeth, or in one famously suspicious case, the milk of the Virgin Mary, are holy items believed to hold real divine power. And when one arrives in your village, it's the medieval equivalent of a celebrity tour. The local priest practically beams as he leads the procession. 2 monks carry an ornate box, decorated with silver filigree and velvet so thick it could smother a sin. You can't see inside, but you're told it contains the finger of a saint. Which saint? Doesn't matter. It's a holy finger, and that's more than enough. Welcome to the strange, sometimes very lucrative world of relics. The medieval church doesn't just traffic in prayers and penance, it's also in the business of wonder. and nothing draws wonder quite like a dusty toe bone encased in gold. Whether it's St. Stephen's kneecap, a splinter from the true cross, or a single strand of hair from a saint who supposedly never had any, relics are treated with immense reverence. Pilgrims travel for weeks just to glimpse them, touch them if they're lucky, heal their ailments, cure their blindness, or at least feel a little more hopeful than they did 2 villages ago. Historians still argue how much of this was genuine faith and how much was carefully orchestrated spectacle. Probably both. A little healing, a little showmanship, a whole lot of incense. And don't assume relics are just randomly displayed. They're placed in reliquaries, fancy containers made of precious metals and glass, often shaped like the body part inside. A reliquary for a saint's hand, shaped like a hand. One for a tooth? You get the idea? There's even a surviving relic of John the Baptist's head in a skull-shaped reliquary that could either inspire devotion or star in a very confused puppet show. You squeeze into the chapel, elbow to elbow with your neighbors. The air is thick with breath and beeswax. The monk opens the reliquary and begins a litany of the saint's miracles. He healed a lame child in Tours. He cured blindness in York. He survived being thrown into a river 3 times. You nod solemnly. That's impressive. You, on the other hand, nearly drowned in a puddle last week. Then comes the offering box. Of course there's an offering box. Pilgrims drop in coins, scraps of cloth, even rings. Not because they have to, but because, well, it feels right. Divine proximity deserves gratitude, and also, perhaps, a little bribe for luck. You fish out a half-penny and toss it in, just in case your back pain isn't from bad posture and is some kind of divine punishment for laughing during Lent. Want a fringe tidbit? Some relics were believed to be so powerful that they couldn't be moved without bad things happening. In one case, an entire town panicked when a visiting bishop tried to borrow a saint's skull for a week of tours. The sky darkened, the chickens stopped laying, and a traveling bard broke his lute string mid-ballad. Message received. And where there are relics, there are pilgrimages. That's the next level. People leave their homes for weeks or months, walking or limping or riding a donkey to sacred sites. Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, Rome, Jerusalem, if they're feeling very ambitious and enjoy the possibility of pirates. These pilgrimages aren't just journeys, they're spiritual adventures, complete with hardship, prayer, roadside ale, and an unfortunate number of flea bites. Pilgrims wear badges to show where they've been, little tin scallop shells, crosses, or saint icons pinned to their cloaks like holy scout patches. The Church encourages these pilgrimages, not just because they're good for your soul, but because they're excellent for business. Every shrine has an economy around it. Inns, food sellers, relic vendors, some more suspicious than others, and scribes offering indulgent certificates for a modest fee. You may have heard a few whisperings about fake relics. A merchant claiming to have a vial of St. Bartholomew's blood might also be selling the toenail of the Archangel Gabriel. And how do you prove him wrong? You don't. You just pay and hope Gabriel isn't insulted. In fact, medieval Europe had multiple heads of John the Baptist, not to mention enough pieces of the true cross to build a small cathedral. Historians still puzzle over whether people truly believed all of them were real or just accepted that relics, like saints, operated beyond normal logic. But whether or not the relic is authentic, the faith around it is real. People cry, kneel, pray. They bring their sick children, their broken hearts, their fears. And sometimes something does happen. A boil disappears, a baby lives, a dream returns. And even if it's just coincidence or the placebo effect blessed by a bishop, it matters. The Church understands this. Relics serve a dual purpose. They inspire awe and reinforce the sacredness of the institution. When you witness a miracle, you don't just thank the saint. You trust the Church that brought the saint to you. As the monk closes the reliquary, you exhale slowly, a little lighter, a little cleaner. You're not sure why. Maybe it's just the incense. Maybe it's the memory of your neighbor kneeling in tears. Or maybe, just maybe, you believe deep down that something holy did just pass through. The relics will leave tomorrow, off to the next town. But for now, your village glows with borrowed sanctity. The church feels warmer, the air more sacred, the world, just for tonight, slightly less terrible. And your bruised turnip, still waiting at the market. Miracles have their limits. It starts with a smell. Not the usual stew and smoke scent of the village, but something sharper, pungent, medicinal. You turn a corner and nearly walk into a man holding a bucket of herbs and muttering Latin under his breath like a nervous wizard. Ah, the parish priest is at it again. Healing. You'd think in a world crawling with death and disease, more people would avoid the sick. But the medieval church? It marches straight into the fever, holding a crucifix in one hand and a bottle of something oily in the other. It's easy to forget now, but the church was the backbone of health care in the Middle Ages. Hospitals, run by monks and nuns, leper houses, administered by the church, wound salves and herbal compresses, mixed in convent kitchens. You break a leg, catch a plague, or grow a mysterious lump on your neck. Your first stop isn't a doctor, if you can even find one, but your priest. And the care isn't just physical, it's spiritual. The illness might be caused by sin, or by demons, or maybe by bad air and too much garlic. Hard to say. But either way, a quick blessing never hurts. Probably. You step into the small stone building that serves as the village's makeshift infirmary. It smells like lavender and regret. A young monk leans over a patient, applying a thick paste made from ground mustard seed, honey, and something that looks suspiciously like mashed plum. The patient wheezes, the monk hums a hymn. Want a fringe fact? Some monasteries kept detailed herbals, manuscripts that listed plants, their uses, and occasionally whether they were more effective if harvested under a full moon or while reciting the Lord's Prayer backwards. It's medicine with a side of mysticism. And then there's the sacrament of extreme unction, known today as the anointing of the sick. It's a special rite for those in danger of death. The priest arrives with oil, murmurs sacred words, and anoints the person's eyes, ears, hands, feet, and lips. The idea is to cleanse them, body and soul, before the final journey. It's solemn, quiet, and somehow more terrifying than comforting, like watching someone pack for a trip they may not return from. Historians still debate how effective the Church's healing practices were. Some claim the prayers and herbs worked because they calmed people down, reduced fevers, and discouraged medieval patients from stabbing themselves with mystery objects. Others point out that survival rates didn't improve much until the invention of soap. Fair, but there's no denying that the Church provided care, emotional, physical, spiritual, and in a time when few people knew what a spleen was, and most thought your moods were controlled by black bile, that kind of care, however imperfect, was often the only hope. You glance over and see an elderly nun gently wrapping a boy's arm. He winces, but she hums as she works, tying the bandage with hands that have done this 1,000 times. Her veil flutters in the warm, herb-scented breeze. Her eyes meet yours, and for a moment you feel oddly reassured. Maybe she knows something you don't. The Church also manages long-term care. Lepers, the blind, the chronically ill, many are sent to monasteries, not for cures necessarily, but for dignity. They're given beds, clean water, and, importantly, prayers. If God won't heal them, He'll at least see them. Want something strange? Some saints became famous specifically because of their diseases. Saint Roche survived the plague and gained a following that still exists today. Saint Dymphna is the patron saint of mental illness. People flock to her shrines, whispering prayers for troubled minds and hearts. You might not get better, but you'll feel less alone. Back in the infirmary, the priest lights a candle beside a woman with sunken cheeks. Her husband stands nearby, wringing his hands. The priest lays a cross on her chest, not for healing this time, but for comfort. Her breaths are shallow. The candle flickers. The prayer is soft. There's no drama, no lightning bolts, no miraculous cures, just compassion. And sometimes that's enough. Later that day, you wander past the convent garden. Raised beds overflow with sage, thyme, feverfew, and rue. You pause to watch a nun carefully snip leaves, muttering to herself about balance and blessings. This is where medicine begins, not in laboratories, but in dirt, devotion, and trial and error. And books, oh, the books. Monastic libraries often house ancient medical texts copied and recopied over centuries. Galen, Hippocrates, Avicenna. Mixed in with psalms and liturgies, you find diagrams of the human body, always slightly off, lists of humors, always confusing, and illustrations of people with snakes coming out of their mouths, always disturbing. The church may not fully understand illness, but it tries. And in an age of mystery fevers and sudden death, trying matters. Of course, there are limits. Not all church figures are gentle caregivers. Some cling to superstition. Others see sickness as punishment. More than one village priest has accused a feverish child of harboring demons. And mental illness? That often gets labeled as possession, which leads to exorcisms that are, let's say, not helpful. You remember the time a traveling friar tried to cure a mute man by screaming at him for 2 hours. It didn't work. It also frightened the chickens so badly they stopped laying eggs for a week. But despite the flaws, the church remains your first call when something goes wrong inside your body, or your soul, or your dreams. You walk home as the sun dips behind the trees. The village is quiet, and the wind carries the scent of thyme and candle smoke. A baby cries somewhere, a bell tolls softly, and in the little stone infirmary a nun adjusts a blanket over a dying man's feet. Not every illness is healed, not every prayer works, but here in the care of the church people are witnessed, tended, loved. Sometimes in a world this fragile, that's the best medicine there is. It's harvest time, and the village is buzzing, scythes swinging, oxen snorting, and your neighbor already complaining about his bad knee. But amid the clatter and sweat, there's something quieter, deeper. You feel it beneath your soles as you work the field. You owe a portion of this crop, not to your landlord, not to the king, not even to that chicken-thieving neighbor. No, this part goes to God, more specifically, the church. Welcome to the medieval tithe, a 10% tax on pretty much everything that grows, bleats, clucks, or walks out of your field. It's a sacred obligation backed by Scripture and enforced with the same gentle firmness as a mother wielding a wooden spoon. You don't tithe. That's not just tax evasion, it's spiritual peril. You haul your sack of grain to the tithe barn, a looming wooden structure that smells of damp straw and divine oversight. Inside, a clerk counts your bushels while muttering fractions and eyeing your produce like he's mentally ranking its sinfulness. That barley looks suspiciously light. And is that sheep really yours? Tithing isn't optional. It's baked into the rhythm of medieval life. A tenth of your grain, your fruit, your wool, your cheese, even in some cases, your beeswax. Yes, beeswax. Apparently God has a fondness for candles. Historians still argue whether the tithe was a fair system or a burdensome relic of older, more exploitative economies. The truth? A bit of both. On paper, it sounds reasonable, a small share for the institution that provides you with education, health care, spiritual guidance, and protection from hellfire. But in practice, when your cow just died, your wheat came in patchy, and your kids have been eating grass soup for a week, that small share feels massive. And it's not just crops. Some tithes are paid in labor, mending the church roof, maintaining the graveyard, helping repair the priest's suspiciously nice fence. Others are collected in coin, if you're lucky enough to have coin. That's called a commuted tithe, and it often involves complicated math, a sour-faced clerk, and the growing suspicion that someone's rounding up. There are three kinds of tithes, if you really want to sound smart in the tavern. Predial, from land like grain or hay. Personal, from labor or trade. And mixed, from things like livestock. And no, that doesn't mean you can pay your tithe in gossip and regrets. Though wouldn't that be convenient? You ask the clerk where the tithe is going. He shrugs. Some stays here to pay the priest, maintain the church, and fund local charities. The rest? Sent up the chain. The bishop gets a cut. The cathedral chapter gets a cut. Occasionally the money ends up in Rome, where it helps gild yet another statue or pay for a bishop's fancy dinner party. Want a weird tidbit? Some priests tried to get clever with tithing laws. One famous story involves a priest arguing that eggs shouldn't be tithed unless they hatched. So he refused to tithe them, then incubated all the eggs in warm hay and ended up with more chickens than sense. The bishop was not amused. Naturally, all this wealth collection leads to problems. People grumble. Some tithe collectors get greedy. Others play favorites. There are entire court records filled with disputes about how much wool a sheep actually owes. In one case, a woman swore her goat hadn't produced any milk all year, then was caught trading cheese under the table at market. Oops! But what if you don't pay at all? Well, the consequences range from stern sermons to ecclesiastical court summons to public penance. Imagine kneeling in front of the whole parish, barefoot and ashamed, while the priest explains to everyone that you didn't give God his fair share of onions. It's a quiet pressure, a social contract wrapped in divine judgment. You don't want to be the person whose crops fail because they didn't tithe. Superstition runs deep. Maybe that moldy apple wasn't random. Maybe St. Lawrence did notice your half measure of barley. Better not risk it. Some monasteries and churches try to soften the blow. They throw harvest feasts, bless the fields, and offer prayers for prosperity in return. Others, not so much. They send out men with ledgers and stern expressions who know exactly how many pigs you raised this season. One of them even has a nickname, Father Fork. Still, there's a strange comfort in the ritual of it all. Every season has its dues. You know what's expected. You give what you can. You pray it's enough. And somehow the world keeps turning. Want a fringe twist? In some places, villagers began forming tithe rebellions, small, localized groups who refused to pay, arguing that the clergy was corrupt or that they'd already given too much. These movements usually fizzled, no match for the church's reach, but they hint at a growing frustration. The system wasn't perfect, and people knew it. As you leave the tithe barn, lighter of grain but heavier of thought, you pass the priest's house. He's trimming his grapevines and humming. His robe looks new. His sandals look imported. You raise an eyebrow. He smiles and offers a wave. You wave back, polite, quiet. But you wonder what he'd do with a tenth of your thoughts. The sun sets over the fields. Your harvest is in. The tithe is paid. You still have enough to last the winter, you hope. And tomorrow the priest will bless the next season's seed. Because even when you grumble, even when you mutter that the church doesn't need your cabbage, deep down you want the blessing, just in case. Because in the medieval world, everything grows under the shadow of the steeple, even your turnips. The sun barely peeks over the thatched roofs when the bell begins to ring, not the slow toll of a funeral or the gentle call to prayer, but something faster, urgent. You poke your head out the cottage window and see a rider galloping into the village, cloak flapping like a banner of bad news. You squint. Yep, it's the bishop's messenger. This can only mean one thing. The bishop is coming. Cue the panic. The priest drops his breakfast. The altar boy is told to sweep everything, even things that don't need sweeping. Someone starts polishing the iron bell pull with spit and wool. The whole village moves as if St. Peter himself were dropping by for a surprise inspection, because, in a way, he is. Your local priest may run the parish, but bishops are the high-powered spiritual landlords of the medieval church. They oversee multiple parishes, sometimes dozens, and act as both religious authorities and minor nobles. Some are humble shepherds of souls. Others live more like lords, with velvet gloves and hunting falcons, and enough rings to make a relic jealous. The bishop's role is vast, confirming baptisms, ordaining priests, overseeing church property, issuing spiritual judgments, and making sure no one's been secretly marrying their cousin twice removed. Again, he's also responsible for visitations, those surprise or semi-surprise checks where he inspects the spiritual and physical health of each parish. Think medieval quality control, but with incense. Historians still argue whether these visitations were mostly about genuine reform or just maintaining control and collecting fees. Truthfully, it was both. Some bishops were true reformers, others just liked the sound of their own entourage. You gather with the rest of the villagers as the bishop arrives, riding a tall horse, his robe dusted only slightly from travel. He's flanked by clerks, guards, and a scribe who seems alarmingly eager to write things down. Behind them, a pair of servants carries the bishop's chair just in case he needs to sit majestically. He dismounts with practiced grace, offers a blessing with two fingers raised, and your priest bows so low he almost face plants. First stop, the church. The bishop steps inside, makes the sign of the cross, and immediately starts inspecting. He checks the altar linen, too wrinkled, the candlesticks, dusty, the crucifix, slightly askew. He quizzes the priest on liturgical Latin, then turns to the congregation and asks a few villagers questions like, "Do you know your prayers?" and "Has the priest been living modestly?" Everyone nods nervously, except little Edith, who blurts out that she saw Father Benedict sneaking extra wine last week. The bishop raises an eyebrow. The priest coughs. Edith is quietly ushered outside and handed a suspiciously large sweet roll. Then comes the bishop's court, a traveling ecclesiastical tribunal held right here in your village. Clergy-related complaints, disputed marriages, tithing troubles, and accusations of heresy or immorality all get aired. It's less exciting than it sounds, unless you enjoy watching two farmers argue over who owns a very holy goat. One by one, people step forward. A man accuses his wife of refusing to attend Mass. A woman complains that her neighbor cursed her chickens. The bishop listens, nods, consults his scribe, and hands down gentle or not so gentle spiritual sentences. Often penance, fasting, prayer, public apology, maybe a short pilgrimage if you're really in trouble. Fringe detail. Some visitations uncovered things that shocked even hardened bishops. Illicit affairs, fake relics, priests who hadn't preached a proper sermon in 10 years. There's even a recorded case where a parish was using sheep's blood instead of wine for Mass because the priest liked to drink the real stuff himself. That bishop left in a huff and excommunicated 3 sheep. Back in your village, things aren't quite that dramatic. The bishop completes his inspection, grants absolution to the penitent, and blesses the harvest field with a sprinkling of holy water and the kind of prayer voice that sounds just slightly better than yours. Must be part of bishop training. You watch as he's escorted to a banquet prepared in his honor. Bread, stew, ale, and a goose fattened 3 months in advance. The priest beams as the bishop takes a bite. The villagers cheer. Someone starts singing. And you realize that, for all the nerves and chaos, having the bishop visit does mean something. It's recognition, oversight, a reminder that your tiny village is part of something vast. Because bishops don't just pass through, they connect you to the wider church, the cathedral, the archbishop, Rome, the pope. It's a chain that stretches from your muddy boots to the marble floor of St. Peter's Basilica. And, of course, bishops carry the power of confirmation, the rite where children are blessed and anointed, strengthening their bond with the church. It's like a spiritual upgrade from basic baptism to full membership. The bishop lays his hand on each child's head, mutters Latin, and voila! Another soul tucked firmly under the church's wing. Some bishops are inspiring, others are pompous. Most are somewhere in between. But when they pass through your world, things happen. Potholes are fixed, choirs suddenly remember how to harmonize, and Father Benedict mysteriously gives up wine for a whole week. Later that evening, as the bishop's retinue rides off into the sunset, you breathe a sigh of relief. The inspection is over. The church survived. The wine allegedly did not. But more than that, you saw the larger church in motion. Not just words in Latin or coins in a tithe box, but flesh and blood and horsehair. Something real, something watching, something that, even from afar, still shapes your life. You return home to your modest stew, a little tired, a little amused, and you quietly thank little Edith for being the kind of witness bishops never forget. It's raining again, the kind of steady, bone-dampening drizzle that turns roads to soup and roofs to sieves. You wrap your cloak tighter, muttering to yourself about mold and misery when someone calls your name. It's a neighbor, beaming, holding a soggy parchment. "He's written back," she says. You blink. "Who?" She holds the parchment up like a holy relic. "The bishop's scribe. My son's joining the monastery." Ah, the monastery. That mysterious place on the edge of your world where people go to pray, work, and, allegedly, get out of weeding turnip patches. Today, we're peeking behind the cloister wall. You've always wondered what really goes on inside a medieval monastery. From the outside, it's a quiet complex of stone buildings surrounded by hedges and rumors. But inside, a world governed by the rule. Not rules plural, just the rule. Specifically, the rule of Saint Benedict. Written in the 6th century, this little guidebook became the foundation of monastic life across Europe. It dictates when monks wake, what they eat, how they pray, how they sleep, and even how they think. Spoiler, there's not a lot of room for freelancing. You step into the cloister, the covered walkway that circles the inner courtyard. Rain patters on the stone. A monk passes silently, nodding. He's barefoot, wearing a coarse wool habit and carrying a small basket of apples. He smells faintly of candle wax and turnip soap. Daily life here runs on a strict schedule. Ora et labora. Pray and work and repeat. The bell rings up to 8 times a day for prayer, marking everything from sunrise to bedtime. Between prayers, monks copy manuscripts, grow food, tend animals, and make things like wine, cheese, and, if they're in a generous mood, mead. Want a weird tidbit? Some monks became so good at making beer that local taverns complained it was too high quality and undercutting their business. Nothing says divine competition like heavenly hops. Not all monks live the same way. There are different types of religious life. Cenobites live in communities like this one. Hermits go full solo mode in the wilderness. And anchorites, They're walled into tiny cells attached to churches, spending the rest of their lives praying, reading, and hoping the builder didn't forget ventilation. Historians still debate whether most medieval people respected monks or just thought they were slightly odd neighbors who happened to chant a lot. Truth is, they were both revered and resented. On one hand, they were holy men living in self-denial. On the other, they sometimes owned more land than the local lord and produced wine that somehow never made it to the village. But let's be fair. Monasteries weren't just places of prayer. They were hubs of literacy, art, and learning. In a world where most people couldn't read, monks copied ancient texts by hand, word by word, letter by letter, on parchment made from animal skin. They illuminated manuscripts with gold leaf, deep blues, and tiny doodles of knights fighting snails. Yes, snails. Why? Scholars still argue about that. You peek into the scriptorium where the writing happens. The room is quiet except for the scratching of quills. A young monk dips his pen into ink, carefully inscribing a page of psalms. His brow is furrowed. His desk is cluttered with knives for sharpening, sand for blotting, and something that looks like a crumbly biscuit for nibbling. You recognize the illuminated letters, large, ornate, often shaped like dragons or ivy. It's strange, isn't it? These silent men tucked away in their stone world are preserving the thoughts of saints, philosophers, and even the occasional Roman playwright. The rest of the world may be arguing over pigs and potholes, but here ideas endure. And, of course, bishops carry the power of confirmation, the rite where children are blessed and anointed, strengthening their bond with the church. It's like a spiritual upgrade from basic baptism to full membership. The bishop lays his hand on each child's head, mutters Latin, and voila, another soul tucked firmly under the church's wing. Some bishops are inspiring, others are pompous, most are somewhere in between. But when they pass through your world, things happen. Potholes are fixed, choirs suddenly remember how to harmonize, and Father Benedict mysteriously gives up wine for a whole week. Later that evening, as the bishop's retinue rides off into the sunset, you breathe a sigh of relief. The inspection is over. The church survived. The wine allegedly did not. But more than that, you saw the larger church in motion. Not just words in Latin or coins in a tithe box, but flesh and blood and horsehair. Something real, something watching, something that, even from afar, still shapes your life. You return home to your modest stew, a little tired, a little amused, and you quietly thank little Edith for being the kind of witness bishops never forget. It's raining again, the kind of steady, bone-dampening drizzle that turns roads to soup and roofs to sieves. You wrap your cloak tighter, muttering to yourself about mold and misery when someone calls your name. It's a neighbor beaming, holding a soggy parchment. "He's written back," she says. You blink. "Who?" She holds the parchment up like a holy relic. "The bishop's scribe. My son's joining the monastery." Ah, the monastery. That mysterious place on the edge of your world where people go to pray, work, and, allegedly, get out of weeding turnip patches. Today, we're peeking behind the cloister wall. You've always wondered what really goes on inside a medieval monastery. From the outside, it's a quiet complex of stone buildings surrounded by hedges and rumors. But inside, a world governed by the rule. Not rules plural, just the rule. Specifically, the rule of Saint Benedict. Written in the 6th century, this little guidebook became the foundation of monastic life across Europe. It dictates when monks wake, what they eat, how they pray, how they sleep, and even how they think. Spoiler, there's not a lot of room for freelancing. You step into the cloister, the covered walkway that circles the inner courtyard. Rain patters on the stone. A monk passes silently, nodding. He's barefoot, wearing a coarse wool habit, and carrying a small basket of apples. He smells faintly of candle wax and turnip soap. Daily life here runs on a strict schedule. Ora et labora. Pray and work and repeat. The bell rings up to 8 times a day for prayer, marking everything from sunrise to bedtime. Between prayers, monks copy manuscripts, grow food, tend animals, and make things like wine, cheese, and, if they're in a generous mood, mead. Want a weird tidbit? Some monks became so good at making beer that local taverns complained it was too high quality and undercutting their business. Nothing says divine competition like heavenly hops. Not all monks live the same way. There are different types of religious life. Cenobites live in communities like this one. Hermits go full solo mode in the wilderness. And anchorites, they're walled into tiny cells attached to churches, spending the rest of their lives praying, reading, and hoping the builder didn't forget ventilation. Historians still debate whether most medieval people respected monks or just thought they were slightly odd neighbors who happened to chant a lot. Truth is, they were both revered and resented. On one hand, they were holy men living in self-denial. On the other, they sometimes owned more land than the local lord and produced wine that somehow never made it to the village. But let's be fair. Monasteries weren't just places of prayer. They were hubs of literacy, art, and learning. In a world where most people couldn't read, monks copied ancient texts by hand, word by word, letter by letter, on parchment made from animal skin. They illuminated manuscripts with gold leaf, deep blues, and tiny doodles of knights fighting snails. Yes, snails. Why? Scholars still argue about that. You peek into the scriptorium where the writing happens. The room is quiet except for the scratching of quills. A young monk dips his pen into ink, carefully inscribing a page of Psalms. His brow is furrowed. His desk is cluttered with knives for sharpening, sand for blotting, and something that looks like a crumbly biscuit for nibbling. You recognize the illuminated letters, large, ornate, often shaped like dragons or ivy. It's strange, isn't it? These silent men, tucked away in their stone world, are preserving the thoughts of saints, philosophers, and even the occasional Roman playwright. The rest of the world may be arguing over pigs and potholes, but here ideas endure. Of course, there's more to feast days than food. There's Mass, sometimes multiple, and special prayers, readings, and processions. Incense flows thicker than usual. Candles multiply like rabbits. Choirs practice for days, and the priest dusts off his finest vestments, gold embroidery, velvet trim, and the kind of hat that could double as a small tent. You arrive at church to find the nave packed. People wear their cleanest tunics. The local lord is in attendance, half asleep but pretending to care. The air is thick with beeswax and anticipation. As the organ wheezes into life, everyone rises, the bells ring again, and the liturgy begins. Want something fringe? Some feast days had forbidden activities. No working, no fighting, no lawsuits, a rare chance to pause, and an even rarer chance for peasants to say, "Sorry, can't weed the cabbage patch. It's St. Friedeswide's Day." Try that with your landlord. The church calendar didn't just guide spiritual life, it structured all of life. Contracts referenced feast days. Births and deaths were remembered in connection with saints. Even weather predictions leaned on them. If it rains on St. Swithin's Day, it'll rain for 40 more, the old woman mutters, squinting at the sky. And then, of course, there are pilgrimage feasts. Big name days, like All Saints or the feast of a local patron, draw travelers from across the region. Merchants set up stalls. Bakers go wild. The town square smells like fried dough and damp wool. Someone selling relic badges, and someone else is offering Saint-Blessed tooth powder. You try not to ask questions. One year, you remember, a group of traveling jongleurs set up a puppet play for the feast of St. Catherine. It involved a wheel, some dramatic squealing, and a suspicious amount of slapstick. The bishop frowned. The children laughed. Everyone agreed it was the best feast in years. The church, surprisingly, allows joy. Not everywhere and not all the time, but on feast days the rules bend. Music is encouraged. Dancing is tolerated, depending on the bishop. Flirting behind the hay cart is overlooked, so long as it doesn't lead to any unblessed surprises 9 months later. Feasting itself becomes a holy act, sharing food, singing together, honoring a saint's life. All of it draws the village closer, not just to God, but to each other. The church knows if you want to teach people, start with their stomachs. You help set out food, barley bread, cheese, smoked fish, and a pie that might contain goose or regret. A priest blesses the table, everyone claps, and for a while the world feels generous. The bells ring again as evening falls, a bonfire is lit, faces glow red and gold. Someone starts a song you half remember from your childhood. Someone else hands you a mug of something warm and mildly suspicious. You sip, you laugh, you sway, and as the stars blink open overhead, you realize this is the kind of theology that doesn't need words, a theology of feast, of joy, of flame and bread and shared breath. In a world where famine always looms and plague is never far, celebration itself becomes resistance. The church knows this. The church teaches this. And tonight, with your belly full and your spirit humming, you understand it too. You're half asleep, clutching a lukewarm mug of ale when the parish bell rings again. But this time, it's not calling you to prayer or celebration. It's slower, heavier, a toll, not a chime. Someone has died. You pull your cloak tight and trudge toward the churchyard, boots squelching through mud. The funeral procession is already assembling, a solemn line of villagers, the priest at the front, swinging a brass censer that puffs little clouds of incense into the gray air. In the medieval world, death is not a surprise. It's more like an old neighbor, unwelcome but always around. The church is there for every step of your life, but it shines especially brightly at the end. Whether you're a peasant or a prince, your journey out of this world passes through the church's careful hands. Today's funeral is for Thomas, the village miller, a good man mostly, bit of a gossip. Once swore a badger stole his shoe, but he tithed, he confessed, and he died with a crucifix in his hand. That's what counts. The church's death rituals are elaborate. They begin even before you die. If you're lucky, or unlucky depending on your view, you sense the end coming. You call for a priest. He arrives with oil and sacraments. You confess your sins. You receive the Eucharist, your viaticum, the food for the journey. Then comes the anointing, those holy oils applied to eyes, ears, lips, hands, feet. Every doorway sin might have crept through. The priest prays. Your family gathers. Everyone waits. When the soul finally leaves, the bell rings, the passing bell, and neighbors murmur prayers, even if they didn't like you much, just in case. Now comes the wake. No, not the party with wine and jokes you might think of today. This is a vigil, candlelit, hushed, filled with psalms and the rustle of rosary beads. Friends and kin sit with the body, keeping company through the night, to show respect, to keep evil spirits at bay, to say goodbye. Want a fringe belief. In some parts of medieval Europe, people placed coins on the eyes of the dead, not to pay the ferryman, like in Greek myth, but to keep the eyelids shut. No one wanted to see old Thomas peeking. The next morning, the priest arrives again. The body is wrapped in a simple shroud. No fancy coffins here unless you're nobility. It's carried to the church, placed before the altar. Mass is said. Prayers for the soul's journey. A sermon. If the priest has anything to say, or if he just likes the sound of his voice. The church teaches that death is a threshold, not an end. Your body may be cold and still, but your soul, oh, your soul's off to face judgment, which means now's the time for prayer. Lots of prayer. Historians still argue how much of this was about true theology and how much was rooted in community tradition. But either way, people took it seriously. The soul's fate wasn't a coin toss, it was a matter of intercession. Because even after you die, people can help. That's where purgatory comes in, not quite heaven, not quite hell, a sort of cosmic waiting room full of spiritual cleansing and, let's say, mildly unpleasant purification. You're destined for heaven eventually, but first your soul needs scrubbing. And the living? They can help speed it up. That's why, after Thomas is buried in the churchyard, right under that gnarled yew tree, the prayers don't stop. Masses are said in his name, candles are lit, alms are given. The church even encourages wealthy families to endow chantries, small chapels where priests say masses specifically for the dead. A soul with friends is a soul with momentum. Want a quirky twist? Some people included prayer clauses in their wills. Pay this monastery to say 30 masses, or feed the poor every St. Cuthbert's Day, and make sure they say my name. It's eternal insurance, and honestly, a bit of spiritual networking. But not all death is neat. Some people die suddenly, without confession or anointing. That's bad, really bad. The church teaches that dying in a state of mortal sin means eternal damnation. People panic. Prayers are doubled. Sometimes priests retroactively bless a deathbed, hoping to sneak grace in the back door. Others are excommunicated, outlaws, or heretics. They get no Christian burial, no bell, no mass, just a shallow grave and an uneasy silence. You don't even want to walk past it at night. The church graveyard is sacred ground. Bodies are buried facing east, toward the rising sun, and symbolically, the resurrection. The priest is buried closest to the church. The rest of us, somewhere between the yew tree and the boundary wall. It's humble, but it's blessed. As the funeral ends, you watch the villagers scatter. Some linger, a few weep. The priest lingers a little longer, tracing a cross in the air above the grave. The clouds shift. A single sunbeam touches the mound of fresh earth, and you realize, for all the doom, the church's death rituals aren't about fear. They're about continuity. From the cradle to the grave and beyond, the church is a bridge, a guide, a quiet presence in a world filled with uncertainty. It teaches that death is not chaos. It is a rite, a path, a door with a handle made of prayer. You walk back through the village, the tolling of the bell still echoing in your chest. Someone will die next week. Someone will be born. The bell will ring again, and through it all, the church will be there, with oil, with incense, with words that try again and again to make sense of the silence. You're in the forest, chasing after a runaway chicken, don't ask, and you stumble across something strange, a mossy stone carved with a barely legible cross. Nearby, a worn trail curves toward a tiny stone building, half swallowed by vines. You've just found a hermit cell. This isn't a fantasy novel. In the medieval world, hermits, also called anchorites, recluses, solitaries, were very real and sometimes even famous. People walked miles just to stare at a person who'd chosen to live alone, pray all day, and avoid cheese-related drama. The church has many faces. We've seen the priests and bishops, the friars and monks, but now we meet its strangest members, the ones who walked away from everything. You edge closer. The little structure has one window facing the woods and another, even smaller, looking toward the church. Through that narrow opening, called a squint, the hermit could see Mass but not be seen. It's solitude with a view. Inside, probably nothing but a mat of straw, a crucifix, a few religious texts, and maybe a cat. Hermits weren't fancy, but don't mistake them for dropouts. These weren't lazy people avoiding labor. If anything, they were too committed, pursuing a life of total self-denial, spiritual intensity, and uninterrupted prayer. Many followed rules stricter than monks. Some fasted to the point of illness. Others engaged in extreme penance, sleeping on stone, flagellating themselves, or wearing scratchy shirts made of hair. Saintly? Maybe. Itchy? Definitely. One well-known recluse, Julian of Norwich, lived in a small cell attached to a church. She received visitors through a window and wrote mystical reflections about God's love. Her most famous line, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." You could stitch that on a pillow. But not all hermits wrote theology. Some never spoke at all. Some were lay people who'd had a dramatic moment, survived a plague, committed a sin, or just saw a chicken-shaped cloud, and decided that the world was too noisy. The church approved, usually. After all, they weren't heretics. They were holy weirdos. Fringe fact? To become an anchorite officially, you had to undergo a funeral rite. Seriously, the bishop would read prayers over you as if you were dying, and you'd enter your little cell like a tomb. The door might even be sealed shut. Symbolically, you were dead to the world. And yet, people still came, because even in their silence, anchorites were seen as powerful intercessors. They were believed to be closer to God, like radio towers beaming up prayers 24/7. If your cow stopped producing milk, or your child got sick, or your dreams turned strange, you'd slip a note under the door or whisper your request through the tiny window. It's a paradox. By retreating from society, these solitary souls became centers of it. People wanted their wisdom, their blessing, their reassurance that someone, somewhere, was watching the heavens when everyone else was just watching weeds grow. You peek inside the cell. It's empty now, just cracked stone and cobwebs. But once, someone lived here, maybe for years, maybe decades, watching the seasons change through a slit of glass, whispering prayers into the dark. Historians still argue whether this lifestyle was empowering or oppressive, especially for women who often became anchoresses. Was it a spiritual calling, or just one of the few ways women could hold religious authority without becoming nuns? A fair question. Anchorites like Christina of Markyate and Marjorie Kempe, who was a lot, by the way, often clashed with church officials, but still managed to gain respect and followers. They weren't saints necessarily, but they were voices, and not every recluse stayed reclusive. Some began as hermits and ended up starting movements. St. Francis of Assisi, after all, began in solitude, begging, praying, renouncing wealth. But people followed, and so his private devotion became a public revolution. The mendicant orders, Franciscans, Dominicans, were born from this solitary seed. But not everyone wanted a crowd. Some hermits fled the church hierarchy, others embraced it. Some were adored, others were mocked. One village reportedly built a fake hermit's cell and paid a drunk to sit in it and mumble. He was eventually fired for excessive friendliness. And yet the idea endures that somewhere in the woods, far from the bells and sermons, someone prays in silence, not for fame or power, but just because they must. You sit by the mossy stone for a moment. The trees whisper above. A squirrel stares, and you wonder, what did it feel like to wake up each day knowing no one would ask you for anything but your presence? There's something compelling here, not escapism, but a fierce simplicity. No gossip, no tithes, no bishop inspecting your grain sacks, just time and God, and maybe a cat that only comes around during Lent. You rise, brush the moss from your cloak, and start walking home, back to the noise, the chores, the chattering village. You'll tell someone about the cell. They'll nod, maybe cross themselves, maybe mutter something about ghosts. But tonight, as you fall asleep, you'll remember that hollow stillness, the kind only found in places forgotten by the road. And maybe, just maybe, you'll whisper a prayer of your own, not to be a hermit, but to find a little of that silence right here. The wind smells like damp parchment and old onions, sure signs that the town market is in full swing. You weave through the stalls, past a woman shouting about eel pies and a man trying to sell you a miracle tooth, which looks suspiciously like a chicken bone dipped in wax. But you're not here for fish or fake molars. You're here for news, not just from traders and travelers, but from the friar who's just arrived in his dust-stained habit, carrying nothing but a sack, a staff, and a voice like buttered gravel. Ah, the friars are back in town. If monks are the church's quiet librarians, then friars are its traveling salesmen of faith. Except instead of selling knives, they're preaching salvation. And unlike monks, they don't stay tucked behind monastery walls. Friars live out in the world, in cities, in slums, in marketplaces like this one, where truth and lies swirl together like stew and sweat. You watch as the friar sets down his sack near the well, clears his throat, and launches into a sermon. No pulpit, no choir, just a man and his words, and maybe a chicken clucking dramatically in the background. The rise of the mendicant orders from the Latin mendicare to beg changed the medieval church. Around the 13th century, two major orders burst onto the scene: the Franciscans, founded by St. Francis of Assisi, and the Dominicans, founded by St. Dominic. Both believed that monks were too comfortable, too quiet, too stationary. So they chose poverty, mobility, and preaching. Radical stuff. Imagine it: barefoot friars wandering from town to town, sleeping where they could, living off alms, and preaching with the fire of a caffeinated prophet. They wore simple robes, gray for Franciscans, black and white for Dominicans, and often traveled in pairs for companionship, accountability, and someone to hold the bag when nature called. Historians still debate how truly poor these orders remained as they grew in influence. Some friaries grew wealthy through donations. Some friars got a little too cozy with wealthy patrons. But early on, these guys were revolutionary. They refused land, rejected stable incomes, and insisted on living with the people, not above them. Fringe detail? Some Franciscans were so strict they refused money altogether. You couldn't even touch coins, which made buying lunch complicated. They relied on intermediaries to handle the actual transactions. Spiritual loophole, anyone? You inch closer as the friar's sermon builds steam. He's talking about temptation, about pride, about the shoemaker who overcharged last week. Awkward glance from the crowd. He gestures wildly, quotes scripture from memory, and even throws in a parable about a fox and a wine barrel. And people listen, because friars, unlike many clergy, speak the local language. They use metaphors from real life. They preach on street corners and in taverns. They joke. They cry. They make you feel like God might actually know what an eel pie is. And they offer something precious: confession. That's right. Friars are fully ordained, which means after the sermon, there's often a line. People wanting to confess sins they can't say out loud at the village church, especially in cities where anonymity is possible and sin is plentiful. You remember hearing about the inquisitors, those terrifying figures from the Dominican order who rooted out heresy with alarming intensity. Yes, same friars, different mood. The Dominicans were sometimes called the Dogs of the Lord, a nickname they wore like a badge, and their enemies used like a growl. But don't let that scare you too much. Most friars were more concerned with pastoral care than purging heretics. They taught. They helped the poor. They ran hospitals and schools. One friar in England reportedly helped save a city from plague by organizing sanitation efforts. Another taught algebra. Go figure. And yet, not everyone loved them. Some clergy resented the friars' popularity. They preached better sermons, collected alms in their parishes, and drew big crowds. Tensions flared. There were even brawls, yes, literal brawls, between monks and friars over who had the right to preach in certain towns. Imagine two men in robes throwing punches while shouting about the Trinity. Unholy, but entertaining. You toss a coin into the friar's bowl. He nods, blesses you, and immediately hands the coin to a barefoot child nearby. That's the image he wants to leave behind. And it works. As you wander off, you hear snippets of his next story. It's about St. Francis talking to birds. Some people chuckle, some roll their eyes, but they all listen. And that's the magic. Friars were the Church's flexible response to a rapidly changing world. As cities swelled, trade exploded, and society shifted, the old monastic model wasn't enough. People needed preaching that moved, poverty that preached, faith with feet. And so the friars became the Church's voice on the road. Loud, dusty, compassionate, sometimes irritating, but always there. You leave the market with your ears full of parables and your hands full of stale bread. The friar's voice fades behind you, but his stories, they'll follow you home, because in a world spinning faster than ever, sometimes the best anchor is a stranger in sandals, telling you that even the fox finds grace. It's a sticky afternoon, and you're stuck in the miller's shed listening to him argue with the reeve about flour taxes, when a boy bursts in waving a bit of parchment like it's a holy relic. "The relics are coming," he gasps. "They're bringing the saint's toe." Everyone freezes. The reeve squints. "Which toe?" "Left big toe, I think," says the boy, "wrapped in silk." And just like that, your afternoon plans change. Because in the medieval church, nothing draws a crowd faster than a holy relic on tour. Relics, physical remains, or belongings of saints, aren't just morbid souvenirs. They're the Church's treasure map to the divine. A saint's femur, a scrap of robe, a drop of blood, or what looks like it. These things aren't just revered, they're powerful. Touching one might heal your sciatica. Praying near one might save your soul, or at least your turnips. You join the stream of villagers heading toward the church. The atmosphere's a mix of excitement, reverence, and street fair chaos. There's a merchant selling little wax toe replicas. A monk is trying to shout over a juggler. And someone's already fainted, probably from heat, possibly from holiness. Relics are divided into three classes. First class, actual pieces of a saint's body, bone, hair, or, very rarely, a whole preserved corpse. Second class, items the saint touched or wore, and third class, objects that have touched a first or second class relic. That includes cloths, crosses, and the occasional chicken feather. It gets creative. Today's relic, a supposed toe of St. Martin, is housed in a gleaming reliquary shaped like a tiny golden boot. It's carried under a canopy by monks, guarded by two nervous altar boys who look like they might drop it at any moment. You lean in to see. It's smaller than expected and disturbingly shriveled. But hey, who are you to question the toe of a 4th century miracle worker? Historians still argue how authentic most relics actually were. Some were verified by bishops. Others just appeared one day with a story and a suspicious smell. The market for relics got so crowded in the Middle Ages that one reforming pope had to issue a ban on selling them, though, let's be honest, the black market was booming. Want a fringe tidbit? There was once a church that claimed to have not one but 4 heads of John the Baptist. Either he was a hydra or some merchants got creative with cow skulls. But even if a relic's origin was fuzzy, its effect was real. Relics attracted pilgrims. Pilgrims brought money. Towns with famous relics built inns, bakeries, bridges. Entire cathedrals were funded by the traffic of believers seeking to kneel near a saint's toenail. You remember your uncle who limped all the way to Canterbury to visit the shrine of St. Thomas Becket. He came back with a silver badge and a tale about his back feeling slightly better. Miraculous, he called it, or maybe just the walking. As the relic is placed on the altar, the priest begins a special mass. The relic is censed, blessed, and displayed. People press forward to touch the glass, or the reliquary, or at least a corner of the cloth covering it. Someone sobs. Someone sings. A child sneezes violently, which the old woman next to you calls a sign. And here's the thing. It's not just spectacle. For medieval Christians, the communion of saints was real and immediate. Saints weren't dead and gone. They were alive in heaven, watching, interceding, caring. Their bodies, even in fragments, were charged with divine favor. To kneel before a relic wasn't superstition. It was closeness, a bridge. You watch as people slip notes into the offering box, requests for healing, for forgiveness, for fertility. The church encouraged this. Relics weren't magic, but they were believed to channel grace. And if you were lucky enough to see one in person, that was a blessing. If it cured you, that was a miracle. And if you lied about being cured, well, that was between you and God. Some relics stayed put, enshrined in churches with guards, candles, and the occasional gemstone. Others were itinerant, traveling from village to village in gilded wagons. Think of it as a medieval rock tour, but with less music and more incense. And sometimes relics were fought over. Literally, monks stole them. Cities claimed them. Whole wars erupted over who got to keep a saint's forearm. In one famous case, the body of St. Nicholas, yes, Santa, was kidnapped from Turkey and smuggled to Italy, where it now rests in Bari and still supposedly leaks fragrant oil. You step away from the altar, a little dizzy. Whether or not the toe was real, the moment was. People sang, people prayed, people believed, and belief, even when built on a bone, builds community. Outside, the jugglers have returned. A vendor offers you a relic bun for a penny. You decline. The sun dips low, and the relic is loaded onto a cart, ready for the next town. A child waves goodbye to the boot-shaped reliquary, and you feel, oddly, calm, because today reminded you that the church isn't just Latin and bells. It's stories, contact, hope, and maybe, just maybe, the scent of sanctity clings to you too, even if it's mostly incense and unwashed pilgrims. The harvest is nearly done. Golden fields are turning to stubble. The sun sinks earlier now, and the village has settled into a rhythm of quiet preparation. You sit outside the church, watching as the last of the apples are brought in, and somewhere in the distance a bell rings, not for Mass this time, but for Vespers, evening prayer. You've heard it countless times, but tonight it wraps around the village like a blanket, a soft hum, a ritual sigh, and you realize this sound has shaped your entire life. For the final chapter of our sleepy journey, let's zoom out. We've wandered through altars, cloisters, markets, graveyards, and even hermit huts. But what does it all mean? What is the medieval church truly? In short, it's everything. It is the center of daily life, a structure of power and piety, a cultural force that threads through every corner of society, from how you're born to how you're buried. It feeds you, taxes you, marries you, forgives you, sings over you, and sometimes scolds you. It is a stage and an anchor, a warm hearth and a high tower, and yet it's also very human. You think about Father Oswald, who still forgets the gospel reading half the time, or that nun in town who bakes terrible wafers but insists they're blessed with texture, or Brother Matthew, who snores during matins but weaves beautiful prayers when he's actually awake. These aren't flawless saints, they're people, people trying to reach God while still getting mud on their boots. The church, in all its grandeur and contradictions, has always walked that tightrope between heaven and earth, between sacred and silly, between the eternal and the very mortal. Historians still argue whether the medieval church was a force for good or control. Did it uplift the poor, or did it just hold them in place with incense and mystery? Was it the guardian of knowledge, or the gatekeeper of power? The answer, frustratingly, is yes, and also no, because this church was not a single monolith, it was a mosaic, a patchwork of bishops with too many rings, monks with too few teeth, pilgrims chasing miracles, peasants whispering prayers into the rafters. A breathing, stumbling, candle-lit crowd moving toward something holy, imperfectly but sincerely. Want a last fringe fact? Some medieval churches had carvings of green men, faces made of leaves, tucked into the corners of stonework. No one's quite sure why. Pagan remnant? Symbol of renewal? Artistic prank? Whatever the reason, it reminds you that the church, even at its most rigid, had room for mystery. You hear laughter from the village green. Children are chasing each other with wreaths made of straw. An old woman is teaching them a hymn, badly but loudly. Overhead, a few crows drift toward the tower spire, where they roost as if trying to overhear Compline. You step inside the church once more. The candles are lit. The air smells of wood smoke and beeswax. The walls, cold and towering, catch the last light. A few villagers kneel in silence. No pomp, no relics today, just quiet prayer and flickering flame. The priest begins a final chant, Latin, old and echoing. You don't understand every word, but you feel the rhythm, the hum, the history. It's a language older than your name, yet somehow still yours. And as the last Amen fades into the stone, you realize something. The church didn't just shape medieval life, it was medieval life. From the ringing of the morning bell to the last whispered prayer of the night, from the glow of stained glass to the mud-caked sandals at the altar, from joy to grief, from feast to fast, from cradle to grave, it was all held in a pattern bigger than any one person could grasp. And that pattern, it continues. Not unchanged, not unchallenged, but still whispering through stone, through scripture, through memory. You leave the church. The stars are out now. The sky is deep and quiet. And somewhere in the distance, another bell rings. Not a call this time, just a reminder. You were here, and it mattered. Let your breath slow now. The bells have fallen silent, and the village is asleep. The candles have burned low. The last chant has faded into the wood and stone of the chapel, leaving behind only the hush that follows something sacred. You lie back on your pillow and feel the weight of the centuries drift over you, soft like a woolen blanket. The footsteps of monks pacing cloisters, the rustle of parchment in candlelight, the clink of a pilgrim's staff on cobbled road. All of it still echoing gently somewhere far in the past. And yet, not so far, because even now, even in our noisy modern world, we still live with shadows of that age. Church bells still ring, candles still flicker, and every now and then someone still sings in Latin just because it feels like something ancient and true. The medieval church was never just about doctrine or dogma. It was about presence, about weaving meaning into the everyday, about pausing for a moment, even now, to light a mental candle in a quiet space. So if your eyelids feel heavy, let them fall. The choir has stopped. The incense has thinned. The saints, whether they had one toe or 4 heads, are resting now. And so should you. All shall be well. All manner of things shall be well. Good night.